Good morning, everyone, and I'm going to speak about the results of the 2020 Teagasc Sustainability Report. In terms of the overview of the presentation, I'm going to start with the theoretical framework or conceptual framework, go through a little bit about methodology used in the study, outline the results, and offer some summary conclusions at the end. Okay, so how do we conceptualize sustainability in this work? Well, it's four dimensions: economic, environmental, social, and innovation. We like to think of it as a three-legged stool where you have the economic, environmental, and social legs of the stool, with innovation as a stabilizer or wraparound. And failure on no one leg of the stool is more important than the other, and failure on one leg of the stool or one of the dimensions can ultimately lead to a failure of our unsustainable farm system. In terms of the data we use for the report, it's the Teagasc National Farm Survey 2020. The sample size is down a little bit on previous years. We're just under 800 farms. We are representing, and that was due to COVID, and a shout out to the Teagasc National Farm Recorders who did Trojan work during lockdown to get the data in. We're still representing 91,000 farms nationally based on population weights from the Central Statistics Office. In terms of utilizable area, you can see the dairy and tillage farms, their farm sizes are slightly higher or are higher than the cattle sheep farms. Also, you notice that even though they're categorized as specialist cattle and a sheep farm, there are significant cattle livestock units on those farms, and that's important when it comes to explaining some of the results down the line. You can see in terms of total livestock units, dairying has the highest, and this is reflected in the farm stocking rate. Although it has higher livestock units, it also has higher land area. Okay, in terms of some housekeeping, when you see a graph or a box plot like that, it's representing the 90%. It's representing the 90th distribution from the 9th to 10th to 90th percentile. The box is into quartile range with the median in the middle. This is we divided the results by top, middle, and bottom by gross margin per hectare, so economic performance. In terms of the colors stay the same throughout the presentation. Dairies in blue, cattle in orange, sheep in purple, and tillage is going to be in green. And when we present data in temporal data, we tend to do it in a time series because you can get short-term positive and negative price of weather shocks that can kind of show up can show up kind of blip in an individual year. So by using a 3-year average, a rolling 3-year average, where the average of say of 13 to 15 is 13, 14, 15, it kind of smooths out or accounts for that level of I suppose variable of external shock factors. In terms of the economic sustainability leg of the stool, we have 6 indicators. The first 2 are gross output per hectare and gross margin per hectare, returns to land. Then we have returns to family farm income, be it per hectare and per unpaid labor unit. So this is kind of that's what everything is paid for. What are the returns to unpaid family labor? Finally, then the last 2 look at kind of the resilience of the system, of the farm system, in terms of how much of the output is derived from the market versus subsidies, and if the farm is economically viable or not. And how do we define viability? Well, if they can achieve the minimum agricultural wage, which is 10.10 in 2020, and give a 5% return on non-net land-based assets, they're regarded as viable. It's a binary yes/no bar essentially. So okay, if you look at the results to gross output, gross margin, and family farm income on a per hectare basis all across the graphics on the left-hand side, you can see the blue, the dairying, significantly higher returns in all those metrics. And that's not a new story. Essentially, we're seeing that in the longer-term trend. Not new essentially in terms of the dairying returning multiples of the other farm systems. Tillage tends to be second, and the cattle and sheep systems at the bottom. Tillage in the middle. Although I said, that clearly there's significant variability across those different systems. I just want to show this is the family farm income for dairy farms, by top, middle, and bottom by economic performance. You can see there's significant variability within systems. So even within dairying, there's significant variability or heterogeneity. So across systems and within systems, the average is hiding a lot in this case. So okay, moving on to productivity of labor. So this is the returns to returns to family farm unpaid labor. You can see the gap between the dairy and tillage farm tends to narrow here because there's significantly a lot more labor, family labor employed on specialist dairy farms, whereas less so on tillage farms. Cattle and sheep again bring up the rear. Sheep a little bit ahead of cattle in 2020 due to better output prices. And again, that's not a new story. You can see the long-term trend there in that dairy and tillage are significantly ahead of the cattle and sheep systems. Dairy being at the top and tillage. The gap between dairy and tillage is not as wide as in a per hectare basis here, because the labor input is higher on dairy farms. So again, look, that's the returns to labor by top, middle, and bottom across the 4 farm systems. So you can see there's significant variability within systems and across systems. So we're presenting the averages there on top. So the averages are hiding a lot here, and it's just to illustrate this point that that there is the variability across and within systems is significant. So in terms of the economic viability, then as I said, where a farmer is viable if they can return the minimum wage and plus a 5% return on land-based assets. And in 2020, it's about just nearly 80% of dairy farms are meeting that bar. It's about 65% of tillage farms, 25% of sheep farms, about 19% of, or about 17-18% of cattle farms. And again, that's not a new story. You can see year on year, dairy farms, about 75% of them are viable, about 65% of tillage farms, and about 20-25% of the cattle and sheep farms. Just to say, I suppose economic dairying is regarded as an economic powerhouse, but those results would show that in a given year, there are still a quarter, 25% of dairy farms not achieving economic viability under this definition. Okay, so moving on to the social leg of the stool. So again, we have 6 indicators. The first 3, vulnerability, isolation risk, and high age profile, they're all at the household level. So this is really assessment of the household. And then we've levels of agricultural education, and finally then kind of work-life balance. The first one is how many hours the main farm holder is working on the farm. And the last one then is total hours worked. And this is kind of off-farm, on-farm, and off-farm employment. So looking at vulnerability, so what's the definition? Let's say, well, it's a 2-pronged one. If the farm isn't economically viable based on the definition outlined under the economic dimensions, and there's no off-farm employment, then the household is regarded as vulnerable. When I say no off-farm employment, I mean the spouse or the farm holder. So you can see it's kind of the reverse of what we saw on the economic dimensions, and that 40% of the cattle and sheep farms are regarded as vulnerable. It's about less than 8% of dairy farms and about 15% of tillage farms. And again, that trend is fairly consistent through time. Dairying 10%, 12%, the tillage between 15 and 20, and the sheep and cattle are 40-45. So the final 2 then I want to look at in terms of social sustainability dimensions are the hours worked on the farm and total hours worked. So you can see hours worked on the farm, dairying, there's a lot more labor hours being put onto dairy farms than the other farm systems on farm. But if you account for off-farm employment, that gap narrows significantly between the other systems. So that the other farm systems are more likely to have off-farm employment, and kind of total hours worked narrows between that and dairy. Dairying is still putting in the most hours of all the farm systems. And that's a fairly consistent trend through time. I'm gonna say that there is an awful lot of farm hours of labor being put into the system, particularly dairy, and one that's questioned the social sustainability of that in the longer run. Okay, so moving into the final leg of the stool. The final leg of the stool is the environmental sustainability. So okay, we're looking at different dimensions here. So the first dimension of environmental sustainability, we're looking at gaseous emissions. So we're tracking greenhouse gases, both agriculture and energy, but we're going to focus on agriculture in this presentation. We're using the IPCC national inventories approach for all farms, mimicking what the EPA do at a national level. We also have a life cycle assessment methodology or model for dairying. We're also tracking gaseous emissions of ammonia. So, and again, we're using the national inventories approach for all farms, similar to what the EPA report under the NEC directive. We're also reporting in the risk water quality bracket, the sustainable use of phosphorus and nitrogen. And it's a farm gate input-output based approach. We're tracking inputs and outputs through the farm gate and seeing what's left over in terms of risk of transfer to the water courses. And we also have a biodiversity indicator in development, and John Finn will speak a little bit about this in the next presentation. So we have 13 indicators overall, and the indicators are the per farm, per hectare, and per kilogram of output basis generally. So you've got your ag-based emissions, your energy-based GHG emissions, your ammonia emissions per farm, per hectare, and per kg of output. At the end, the risk to water quality, the end balance, NMP balances, surpluses, and use efficiencies. Okay, starting with greenhouse gas emissions, ag-based greenhouse gas emissions, we're reporting on a per farm and per hectare basis, which can be regarded as absolute emissions. We're also reporting on a per kilogram of output basis and per euro of output, which can be regarded as emissions intensity. So there's two different approaches here, absolute and emissions efficiency being reported. Let's say we have methodological updates from previous reports. This meant the methodology and the emission vectors and clearly data has constantly been updated. So we have to backcast this data to previous reports. So you won't be comparable with the results in previous reports because it's constantly evolving and updating. We're backcasting the data as we implement the new improved methodologies. Okay, so the first thing to say is in terms of order of magnitude, dairy farms have 3 to 4 times more GHG emissions on the per farm scale than the other farm systems. You can see there in terms of the order of magnitude. But I suppose the other thing to note is that at the bottom in the red circle, even though they're regarded as specialist sheep and tillage farms based on their output, their euro output, the majority of the emissions being generated on these farms are from the cattle enterprise based on the biology. So I suppose the things to note that the order of magnitude in dairying is 3 to 4 times the other farms, and cattle is generating a lot of emissions on the non-specialist cattle farms. In terms of the temporal trend through time, we can see dairying in the blue and on a per farm basis, the emissions have been increasing year on year since quotas are abolished, essentially. And other farms essentially has been static or in decline. Cattle in particular in recent years have been in decline. And because it's 2 to 4 times more livestock farms than there is cattle farms, the decline in it's kind of offsetting what's happening in the dairy side. So the emissions at a farm scale, average farm scale here are relatively static or, towards the end of the study period, increased in the middle of the study period, as you can see there. On a per hectare basis, the relativities, like the gap isn't as large because, as I showed one of the first slides, that dairy have larger farm sizes. So they're about double what cattle farms are in terms of per hectare emissions, 4 times that of tillage farms. And again, that trend is consistent through time. I suppose I would notice that dairy farms are adding more land over the study period, and even though their emissions are going up, as we saw in the previous slide, so is their land area. So the per hectare emissions are fairly static at the end of the study period. And again, the other farm systems, cattle in particular, and sheep to an extent, are declining. And those declines are offsetting what's happening on the dairy side. You're seeing kind of a flatlining essentially of the average farm emissions, which would include all dairy, cattle, sheep, and tillage together. We look at it on a per euro of output basis. You can see that because they have a low revenue generating capacity and the second highest emissions, cattle farms come out worse in terms of GHG per euro of output generated. Sheep farms second, dairy actually come out the second best. But although they have the highest level of emissions, they also have the significantly highest revenue generating capacity. And tillages comes out the lowest because they have the second highest revenue generating capacity and the lowest level of emissions. And again, that trend is fairly consistent through time. Okay, so we can see basically in the non-dairy sector, it's been relatively static or declining story, but on the dairy side, it's been on the absolute emissions that tend to be on the increase. So we look at what's driving that increase. So if you break the dairy farm GHG emissions, you can essentially break it down into 3 components. The first is kilograms of milk produced per cow. And that's been increasing over the study period. So farmers are getting more output per cow, which is good. That's an efficiency gain. And this is all standardized at a kg of fat and protein corrected milk, 4% fat and 3% protein. The second part of the equation is the carbon footprint of that milk, the CO2 per kg of milk. You can see fat product correcting milk. You can see that's declining. So again, that's an efficiency gain that farmers are producing the milk at a lower carbon footprint. So the first two parts of the equation are positive news story. But what's driving the absolute level emissions is the third part of the equation, is the average herd sizes. So you can see there, the bottom right graphic, that dairy size, the herd sizes have been increasing over the study period, and this essentially is overriding efficiency gains being made in the output per cow and the carbon footprint of the milk. If you break it down into its IPCC-based categories, this is for the average dairy farm we're talking about here now in the NFS. You can see that the average emission, the all farm emissions, the top kind of dark blue, I think is trending upwards, but so too is the enteric fermentation, and this is essentially linked to animal numbers. So you can see the overall driving emissions has been associated with enteric fermentation category, which is linked to livestock numbers and so on. The other categories are fairly static over the study period. If you put all farms into the equation, that's dairy, cattle, sheep, and tillage together, the story is a little bit different in terms of the declines in the cattle and sheep sector offsetting the increase in the dairy sector. So you're seeing a relatively flatlining of the overall level of emissions when you look at all farms together. So I mentioned earlier, we do have an LCA model, carbon footprint model for dairying developed by our colleagues in Teagasc Moor Park, and this is the model also used by Borbia in their SDAS, their Sustainability Dairy Assurance Scheme approach. So we've kind of cross-reported here in terms of the numbers. Okay, sample size is different, but the models are the same. So the left-hand side is the farm average, and the right-hand side is weighted by aggregate mixed supply. So you can see the numbers aren't identical, but they are trending or tracking each other in the right directions. So it's kind of good external validity for the approach. Okay, so I've spoken a lot about dairying so far, but we're also tracking the carbon footprint of beef and sheep. So this is the kg of CO2 per live weight beef on the top left, and kg of CO2 for live weight sheep on the right. You can see a little bit they generally tend to be trending downwards. A little bit of a blip on the sheep side in recent times. That's because sheep prices have been better, and farmers have been substituting sheep for cattle livestock units, so more of the emissions are associated with the sheep enterprise. Again, as same with the dairying, there's significant variability. The average is hiding a lot. There's significant variability across that carbon footprint number. The bottom left there is seeing the distribution by economic performance, top, middle, and bottom for the cattle farms. You can see the significant variability in the carbon footprint of that meat of the live weight beef produced, and same for sheep. So the average gain, look at, is hiding a lot, and there's significant variability and room for improvement as well, as essentially within the population. Okay, so moving on to ammonia emissions, then second dimension of environmental sustainability. Again, we're reporting on a per farm and per hectare basis, the absolute emissions, and then emissions efficiency in terms of kilograms of output and euro of output generated. Okay, so similar to the GHG story in terms of order of magnitude, it's actually a little bit higher than GHG. It's about 4 to 5 times higher on dairy farms versus the other farm systems. Cattle being the second biggest, and sheep and tillage being at the lower end of the scale. Similar to GHG, and again circled in red, is that although they're classified as sheep and tillage farms, the majority of those emissions are coming from the cattle enterprise. Again, in terms of the long-term trend, this is at a farm scale. You've seen that the average dairy ammonia emissions have been trending upwards in the blue line there since coal abolished, but there has been a flatlining in recent periods, and recent times. You can see that dairy has flatlined, but the other systems have actually decreased. So you're seeing a decline. We actually saw a decline across all farm systems, all farms, and on a per hectare and a per farm basis on ammonia in 2020. It's definitely some green shoots when it comes to ammonia in 2020. On a per hectare basis, similar to GHG, the relativity isn't as stark because, or the gap isn't as big because the dairy farms have larger farm sizes, so they have more acres area to spread those emissions over. So it's about twice that of cattle, but 4 times of tillage. And again, Again, we've seen a flatlining of ammonia emissions at the end of the study period for dairying, declines in other farm systems, offsetting eventually, in middle of study period declines. We saw increases, but we're definitely seeing declines at the end of the study period for ammonia. In terms of euro of output generated, the ammonia emissions, cattle farms, again, similar to GHG, cattle farms coming out, I suppose, with the highest ammonia emissions because they have the lowest revenue generating capacity and the second highest level of emissions. Cattle or sheep and dairy farms, similar levels for different reasons. Sheep have lower levels of emissions, and cattle and dairy farms have higher revenue generating capacity. So they end up coming out fairly similar in terms of the result, and that long-term trend is fairly consistent through time. I mentioned that the ammonia emissions had fallen across all farm systems and on a per hectare and a per farm basis in 2020. We're definitely seeing some green shoots in this area. Last year the Teagasc ammonia MAC was published, and we really strongly advocated for the switch to protected urea and low emission slurry spreading. We haven't seen much movement on protected urea, and there's reasons behind that in terms of supply chain. But we have seen significant movement towards low emission slurry spreading. 16% of the aggregate slurry in 2019 was applied by low emission slurry spreading, and this increased to 36% in 2020. So definitely seen some green shoots when it comes to ammonia. Okay, so the final dimension I'm going to look at in terms of environmental sustainability is risk to water quality. So again, we're looking at absolute levels. This is the nitrogen and phosphorus balances. All other things being equal, it's a measure of how much risk there is in terms of transfer to the watercourses. This comes with a big caveat, because when we talk about water quality, the local biophysical environment is hugely important. And all other things being equal, kind of covers a lot. Because some soils are riskier than others in terms of nitrogen and phosphorus. A lot of other things being equal, the higher the balance, the higher the risk. Then we're looking at use efficiencies of nitrogen and phosphorus. This is an agronomic measure, how much is being retained within the farm system. And we're also looking at N surplus per kilogram of output in terms of emissions efficiency of production based on N surplus. How we do that, essentially, we're tracking what comes through. If you look at the diagram at the bottom, we're tracking what comes through the farm gate in terms of what nitrogen, phosphorus, and feeds, and fertilizers, manures, and seeds, and so on, and what goes out the far side: milk, meat, crops, wool, manure, and so on. What's one minus the other gives you the surplus, and what's not taken out in product, essentially, is at risk of being lost. All other things being equal. Okay, so if you look at nitrogen balance, essentially it's an accounting based approach, inputs minus outputs at the farm gate level on a per hectare basis. Looking at the results, dairy farms are about 175 kg of the surplus in 2020, significantly higher than all other farm systems. Cattle came out about 60, sheep 50, and tillage about 35. Again, this is balance is, it's driven by nitrogen use, farm practice, but it's also driven by weather. So better years weather-wise, we tend to see lower balances, and poor years weather-wise, we tend to see higher balances. But all other things being equal, the dairy farms will have higher balances because of the higher level of intensity they're operating at in terms of nitrogen input and use and so on. In terms of use efficiency, this is a kind of more of an economic measure of how much energy is being retained within the farm system. It's outputs divided by inputs multiplied by 100, the percentage retention, essentially. So because there's no, because sheep's specialist tillage farms, and the majority, some of them have livestock, but the majority of the emissions are going directly onto the crop, you tend to, in biological terms, have higher end use efficiencies because it's not cycling through an animal. On the dairy side, we saw higher end use efficiencies in 2020 of around 25, sheep around 30, 32, and cattle around 23, and that's fairly consistent trend through time. Look, we're seeing a little bit of an increase in use efficiency on the dairy side at the end of the study period, which is obviously welcome. Okay, so in summary conclusion, if we look at the economic and social metrics, look, dairy performs the strongest on the economic and social metrics, and dry stock is the most challenging. Dairy is, kind of the powerhouse, even though, they say 25% are still not economically viable. but then they also have potentially some challenges in terms of work-life balance, the amount of hours they're putting in there. Dry stocking firms are consistently the most challenged when it comes to economics and the social metrics though. Looking at absolute GHG emissions in 2020, we continue to see an increase on dairy farms at a farm scale, and it's driven by increased herd sizes. However, they're stable on a per hectare basis because dairy farms have been increasing their area farmed. On the other farm systems, they've been static, particularly on sheep and tillage, and they've actually been in decline on cattle farms. And the declines in absolute emissions on cattle farms are offsetting the increases we're seeing on the dairy farms. So on an all farm basis, it's kind of a static, it's fairly static. When looking at ammonia, we're seeing the declines across all systems on a per farm and per hectare basis compared to preceding years. Definitely seen some positive movements when it comes to ammonia. And the emission intensity of production, both on a GHG and ammonia basis, are produced at lower. The product's been produced at a lower ammonia and carbon footprint. And in terms of the innovation, we're definitely seeing increase. We've seen the increased use of low emission slurry spreading, and this is directly affecting the reductions. This is essentially driving the reductions in ammonia emissions. So I've covered a lot in a very short period of time. So thanks for listening. That is my email address, and the report is published at that website there. So I'll hand you back to the chair who's going to choose the next speaker.